When I opened the hive that morning, I realized that my 11 years of beekeeping experience had become completely obsolete. What stood before me was impossible. In the language of nature, such a color, such a sight at the very heart of a hive, simply could not exist. It was as if the bees had carried something from another world into the soul of the colony. I had opened thousands of beehives before the morning I saw honey the color of ink. At first, I thought the light was playing a trick on me. The sun had only just cleared the line of trees beyond the orchard, and the apiary still sat in the long, cool shadow of the windbreak. Light came through the leaves in narrow strips, catching on the metal hive tools, the white lids, and the wings of bees moving in front of me. Under those conditions, ordinary amber honey could look green, silver, even almost black. But not blue. I tilted the frame toward the sun. The color stayed. My name is Jonah. I had been keeping bees for 11 years by then, first as a hobby, then as a job, and eventually as the part of my life around which most other things were arranged. I managed pollination colonies for orchards and seed growers, inspected hives for people who did not have time to inspect their own, and harvested enough honey each year to keep the business steady when the pollination season slowed down. Beekeeping teaches you to distrust first impressions without ignoring them. A quiet hive can be healthy or queenless. A loud hive can be defensive or simply crowded. A dark cell can hold old pollen, spoiled brood, or nothing more serious than a shadow. You look once, then again, and you do not decide until the small details agree with one another. That morning I was inspecting 28 colonies at the edge of a late summer orchard. The main blossom had finished weeks earlier. Clover and wild herbs still grew along the drainage banks, and the bees were bringing in enough nectar to keep the supers filling slowly, but the rush of spring was over. The hives had settled into the measured rhythm of the end of the season. Hive 14 had never given me trouble. It was a 2-year-old colony with a calm queen, a strong population, and a habit of filling the center frames before touching the outer ones. I knew that because I had checked it every 7 to 10 days since early spring. Its brood pattern was even. Its food stores were good. The bees barely noticed me when I lifted the lid. I removed the outer frame, checked the weight, and placed it in the empty frame holder beside the box. The next 2 looked ordinary. Pale wax. Fresh nectar near the upper corners. A thin band of pollen below it. Then I lifted the 4th frame. Near the center was a patch of capped honey about the size of my hand. The wax cappings were almost white, but beneath a few cells where the bees had not yet sealed the surface, the liquid was a deep, clean blue. Not blue-gray. Not greenish. Blue. The color reminded me of fountain pen ink diluted in clear water. I held the frame still and watched the bees move over it. They walked across the cells without hesitation, lowering their heads into the open ones, touching antennae, continuing on. Nothing about their behavior suggested that the material was unusual to them. My first thought was that I had transferred the color myself. Earlier that week, I had marked a queen in another apiary with a small dot of blue paint. The marker had been closed and stored since then, but blue is blue, and memory is often less reliable than confidence. I checked my gloves. Clean. I checked the handle of my hive tool and the edge of the frame box. No paint. The marker was not even in the truck that morning. I changed gloves anyway. Then I looked at the cells more closely. The color was not on the wax. It was beneath it. I brushed a few bees aside with the soft edge of my glove and angled the frame again. The blue liquid sat inside the comb, held behind transparent wax walls. Several cells had already been capped. Whatever had colored them had entered before the bees sealed them. That ruled out a smear from my glove. It ruled out paint falling from a lid. It ruled out most of the ordinary mistakes I could make while standing over an open hive. I lowered the frame into the holder and checked the box itself. The inside walls were clean. The foundation was the same pale wax foundation I used in every hive at that site. There was no colored plastic, no medication strip, no feeder, and no spilled syrup. I had not fed the colony for more than 6 weeks. Even when I did feed, I used clear sugar syrup in plain containers. There was nothing blue in the equipment because there was no reason for anything blue to be there. A bee landed on the back of my hand. I watched her clean one antenna, then lift away. I told myself the color might be botanical. Honey could vary more than most people realized. It could be nearly clear, deep red, dark brown, or almost black depending on the nectar source. Minerals could change it. Storage could change it. Certain honeys develop strange tones under particular light. Maybe I was looking at a rare but harmless combination of nectar and wax. That explanation lasted until I removed the next frame. A second patch appeared near the lower corner. This one was smaller and mostly uncapped. The liquid inside looked even brighter, as if the bees had placed it there more recently. A narrow line of ordinary golden nectar separated it from the blue cells. There was no gradual change between the two. One cell was amber. The next was blue. I set the frame down carefully. The apiary was quiet in the way apiaries are quiet, never silent, but held inside one continuous sound. Thousands of wings made a low, even hum. Leaves moved along the orchard edge. Somewhere beyond the windbreak, a machine started and then faded into the distance. I closed Hive 14 and marked the lid with a strip of plain tape so I would not accidentally move any of its honey with the rest of the harvest. Then I called Miles. Miles kept bees on another property a few fields away. He had started before I had and had the useful habit of offering the least dramatic explanation first. If a hive tipped over, he blamed the stand before the wind. If a colony weakened, he checked food before disease. He was not always right, but he rarely wasted time being impressed by something that had a simple cause. He answered on the fourth ring. "I need you to look at a frame," I said. "What kind of frame?" "The kind with blue honey in it." There was a pause. "Blue mold?" "The liquid is blue." Another pause, longer this time. "Do not taste it." "I wasn't planning to." "That means you were thinking about it." "I was not." "You called me before breakfast." "You were thinking about it." He arrived 40 minutes later in an old work shirt with one cuff buttoned and the other hanging open. I had spent the time checking the remaining colonies. None of them contained blue honey. I inspected every super, every feeder space, and every water source near the stands. 27 colonies showed the normal range of late summer stores: pale gold from clover, darker sections from hedgerow plants, fresh clear nectar where the bees had not yet reduced the moisture. Only Hive 14 was blue. Miles washed his hands at the field tap, pulled on clean gloves, and stood beside me while I reopened the hive. I handed him the first frame without saying anything. He moved it once toward the light, then away. "Well," he said. "That is what I said." "No, you called me." "That is different." He studied the cappings, the wax, and the wooden edges. He smelled the frame without putting his face too close to the bees. Then he looked inside the box. Could be something in the foundation. Same batch as the other hives. Paint from the box. White outside. Bare wood inside. Minerals in their water. The other colonies drink from the same places. He pointed at the blue cells. Could still be mold. Mold does not fill open cells like syrup. "I know. I am trying to give you the answer you asked me here to give. I asked you to look. You asked me because you had already run out of answers you liked." He was right about that. We went through the colony together. The queen was present. The brood looked healthy. There were no dead bees on the bottom board, no sour smell, no unusual moisture, and no sign that the colony had been exposed to chemicals. The workers moved calmly across the frames. Their pollen baskets held yellow, cream, and orange loads from the plants around us. Not one carried blue pollen. Miles finally lowered the frame. "If it is coming from outside," he said, "there should be more of it. Unless they only found it recently. Or unless it is close enough that only this colony found it." I looked toward the fields beyond the orchard. A honeybee could forage several kilometers from its hive when the reward was worth the flight. That covered farms, Gardens, drainage channels, roadside vegetation, a cluster of small workshops, and the edge of an industrial area farther out. I knew the main flowering plants within that range. I did not know every bucket, bin, or leaking container. The thought did not make me feel better. Bees were practical. They did not care whether sugar came from a flower, a split piece of fruit, a discarded drink, or a feeder somebody had forgotten to cover. If it was sweet enough and accessible, they would take it. I removed both blue frames and placed them in clean-lidded boxes. In their place, I gave the colony 2 empty drawn frames from storage so it would have room to work. I fitted a clean monitoring board beneath the hive and checked the entrance one more time. Before closing the box, Miles pointed to a worker near the top bar. "Her mouth," he said. I leaned closer. For half a second, while the bee turned toward the light, I thought I saw a faint blue line along the hairs beside her mouth parts. Then she moved beneath a cluster of workers and disappeared. "Did you see it?" I asked. "I saw something." "That is not the same answer." "No," he said. "It is the honest one." Back in my workroom, I placed the frames on a stainless steel tray that had not been used that season. I photographed both sides under white light. Then I sterilized a small uncapping needle, opened one blue cell, and drew a few drops into a glass sample vial. I did not taste it. The liquid moved like ripe honey, slow but not thick enough to be fully finished. Under the work light, it was even more striking than it had been in the field. Clear blue at the edge. Darker in the center. No sediment. No cloudiness. I checked the moisture with a refractometer I had calibrated that morning. The reading sat within the range of nectar the bees were still reducing. Nothing about its thickness explained the color. When I opened the vial, the smell was sweet, but not purely floral. There was a faint sharpness beneath it, something like fruit syrup after the fruit itself had been removed. I sealed the sample and wrote the date, hive number, frame position, and cell location on the label. Then I went back to the apiary near sunset. I told myself I only wanted to confirm that Hive 14 had settled after the inspection. The truth was that I wanted to know whether the empty replacement frames still looked empty. The bees had already begun using one of them. Along the lower edge, 6 clean cells held fresh liquid. 5 were clear. The 6th was blue. The first patches might have come from an accident I had missed, the new cell could not. Whatever the bees were collecting was still available somewhere beyond the hives. By 8 the next morning, Hive 14 was under quarantine. That sounds more dramatic than it was. I did not put tape around the apiary or call anyone in protective clothing. I placed a red marker on the hive lid, removed the supers that contained questionable stores, sealed them in food-safe boxes, and wrote a note in the harvest log stating that nothing from the colony was to enter the extraction room. Then I did the same thing any careful beekeeper does when something unexplained appears in food. I assumed I might be responsible until I could prove otherwise. The extraction room was the first place I checked. The blue honey had been found before extraction, but contamination rarely respects the neat order in which we want causes to appear. I cleaned the uncapping bench again, examined every container, and looked through the cupboard where I kept queen markers, hive paint, cleaning supplies, and medications. The blue marker I had used earlier that week was closed, intact, and a different shade entirely. Its paint dried opaque. The honey was transparent. I tested a drop of the marker on a piece of spare wax, let it dry, and photographed it beside the sample. There was no reasonable match. Next came the foundation. All the frames in Hive 14 had been built on wax sheets from the same lot used in 9 other colonies. I took and used sheets from storage, shaved thin samples from them, warmed them, and checked for color release. Nothing. I did the same with the blue plastic handles on 2 field buckets, even though neither bucket had been near the hive. The plastic left no stain in water, syrup, or warm wax. By mid-morning, my work table looked as though I were trying to prove a crime committed by ordinary equipment. Small labeled dishes held wax, paint, water, sugar syrup, propolis, and pieces of glove material. None resembled what was in the vial. Miles watched from the doorway with a cup of coffee. You know the blue cells were still inside the hive, he said. I know. So the extractor did not do it. I know. And you are checking the extractor because? Because the day I skip an obvious check will be the day the obvious answer is right. He considered that, then held up the coffee. This is why you write better records than I do and enjoy breakfast less. We returned to the apiary together and checked the nearby water sources. There was a shallow livestock trough beyond the windbreak, a small drainage channel along the lower field, and 2 water pans I kept filled with stones so the bees could land without drowning. All were clear. We took samples anyway. The orchard manager met us near the equipment shed. I asked whether anyone had used dye, marking spray, treated seed, or colored bait in the previous month. He shook his head at each question. A crew had painted survey marks on the far side of the property, but the paint was orange and dry. No one had mixed fertilizer near the hives. No one had spilled fruit concentrate. The irrigation lines carry plain water. Could children have poured something into the hive? He asked. The lids are strapped. The gates were locked. People climb gates. They do, I said. But they would have had to open one colony, pour liquid into individual cells without wetting the wax, close it again, and then return at sunset to fill a new cell. He looked toward the hives. So not children. Probably not. I checked the small motion cameras that covered the field entrance and the equipment area. No one had entered overnight except Miles and me. The cameras did not face the hive entrances closely enough to show individual bees, but they ruled out a person standing over Hive 14 with a bottle of blue liquid. That left the landscape. For the rest of the day, I walked it. I started with the obvious flowers. Chicory grew along one bank with blue petals, but petal color did not simply pour into nectar. Borage appeared in 2 gardens beyond the orchard. A few late cornflowers remained near an old vegetable plot. None produced honey that looked like the sample, and none explained the manufactured sharpness in its smell. I checked fallen fruit under trees, bins behind the farm shop, compost piles, animal feed containers, and the waste area beside a small bakery farther along the main road. Everything sweet was either dry, covered, or too distant from the bee traffic I could see. I spoke with 3 growers, 2 gardeners, and a man who repaired agricultural machines. Each offered a version of the same explanation. Somebody must have left syrup outside. It was sensible. It was also impossible to prove by asking people whether they had made a mistake they might not have noticed. That evening, I placed shallow dishes of clear syrup at controlled distances inside the apiary, each covered so only the test insects in mesh cages could reach them. I added tiny amounts of the materials I had collected: water from the trough, water from the drainage channel, dust from the hive lid, scrapings from the foundation. Nothing turned blue overnight. The next morning, I checked Hive 14 before sunrise. The 6 fresh cells on the replacement frame were still there. The blue one had been joined by 2 more. No other colony showed any color. I called Leah. Leah worked in a small independent food laboratory that handled honey authenticity tests, fruit concentrates, and contamination checks for local producers. I had sent her suspicious honey twice before, once when a beekeeper thought his crop had been adulterated, and once when a batch developed a medicinal taste after being stored near treated wood. In both cases, she had found an ordinary answer and delivered it without making the person who asked feel foolish. When I described the sample, she asked 3 questions. Is the color on the comb or in the cells? In the liquid. Did you feed colored syrup? No. Did you taste it? No. Good. Bring the frame, the vial, clear honey from the same hive, and clear honey from 2 neighboring hives. Separate tools for each sample. I arrived that afternoon with more containers than she had requested. Leah wore a white coat over an ordinary green sweater and listened while I explained the sequence from the first frame to the new blue cells. She did not react to the color until I placed the vial under the bench light. Then she leaned closer. That is impressively blue, she said. I was hoping you would tell me it only looked that way. It only looks blue because it is blue. Helpful. I can be less certain if that makes you comfortable. She divided the sample for several tests. Some results would take days, but the first checks were simple. The liquid sugar concentration was close to immature honey. Its acidity was higher than the clear nectar from the same hive. Under a microscope, the blue fraction contained very little pollen. That mattered. Honey made from floral nectar usually carried at least some trace of the plants the bees had visited. Pollen counts varied, and filtering or unusual flower structure could reduce them, but a nearly pollen-free sweet liquid suggested that the bees had collected something other than nectar. Leah placed two slides beside each other. The clear sample has a mixed pollen profile, she said. The blue sample has a few grains, probably carried over inside the hive, but not enough to explain the sugar. So they found syrup. Possibly. Or fruit liquid. Or processed food waste. I am not calling it until the color test comes back. The preliminary color test came back the following morning. It was not a plant pigment. Leah called while I was loading empty supers into the truck. The blue is a manufactured food color, she said. Water-soluble. Stable in acid. The sample also contains added fruit acids and a preservative that would not come from a flower. I stopped with one hand on the truck door. Could it come from medication? Not from anything approved for hive use that I know of. The sugar profile is mixed. Part honey, part something closer to a processed drink or fruit concentrate. Is it dangerous? I do not know what else is in it yet, so treat it as unsuitable for food. The color itself may be permitted in food, but that does not make an unknown source acceptable. I already isolated everything. I assumed you had. I looked across the yard toward the sealed boxes from Hive 14. A manufactured sweet liquid narrowed the possibilities, but it also made the problem harder. Flowers followed seasons and locations. Processed sugar followed people, schedules, deliveries, cleaning routines, and mistakes. I spent the next 2 days contacting every business I could identify within a practical foraging radius. The bakery used clear glaze and kept its waste bins closed. A small frozen dessert workshop handled colored syrup, but all liquid waste went into sealed drums inside the building. A beverage warehouse stored finished containers, not open concentrate. A food recovery plant near the industrial edge processed damaged and off-spec products, including sweet liquids, but its reception staff said all material was unloaded through enclosed connections and held in covered tanks. No one reported a spill. No one had seen bees. No one believed their site could be the source. I did not blame them. From the ground, every waste area I inspected looked controlled. Lids closed. Drains clear. Concrete dry. If sweet blue liquid had been sitting outside in a quantity large enough to attract thousands of foragers, I expected to see more than bees. Wasps, flies, ants, stains, a smell, something. There was nothing. Then the blue honey stopped. On the fourth morning after Leah's call, Hive 14 contained no new colored cells. The next 2 mornings were the same. I checked the replacement frames, the surrounding colonies, the monitoring boards, and the field cameras. Clear nectar only. Miles thought that was good news. Whatever they got into was gone, he said. Somebody cleaned a spill. A bin was emptied. Problem over. Maybe. You have lab results, isolated comb, and no repeat. That is a complete enough answer for most people. It is not an answer. It is a safe ending. I understood what he meant. The honey had not reached a customer. The colony was healthy. I could remove the affected comb, test the remaining stores, and continue with the season. Beekeeping contained enough real problems that inventing work for myself was unnecessary. But the disappearance bothered me for a practical reason. Permanent sources left permanent patterns. A flowering crop opened and faded over days. A leaking feeder stayed available until it emptied. A contaminated water source affected more than one colony. This source had appeared, supplied enough liquid to fill dozens of cells, and then vanished completely. That meant availability was controlled by a schedule, a process, or a condition I had not yet measured. I stopped searching only for a place and began recording time, temperature, wind, and the first flights of every morning. If the source returned, I wanted to know what had returned with it. For the next 9 mornings, I reached the apiary before the bees did. I parked beyond the windbreak so the truck would not disturb their first flights. Then I sat on an overturned hive lid with a notebook, a thermometer, and a cup of coffee that was usually cold by the time I remembered it. I recorded the same things each day. Temperature at first light. Wind direction. Cloud cover. The time the first workers appeared at each entrance. The direction of the heaviest returning traffic. Hive weight from the scales beneath 14 and the 2 colonies beside it. Any unusual smell, color, or activity. Most mornings gave me nothing but ordinary numbers. The bees began with short orientation flights, then spread toward the orchard margins and the fields beyond. Yellow pollen arrived from late weeds. Cream-colored loads came from clover. Hive weights rose slowly through the afternoon and fell slightly overnight as the colonies used water and evaporated moisture from nectar. No blue appeared. The longer the hives remained normal, the easier it became to doubt the importance of what I had seen. I did not doubt the sample. Leah had confirmed the dye and the processed sugar. But I began to wonder whether the event had been too brief to reconstruct. A damaged container might have leaked for one afternoon and been removed. A driver might have rinsed a tank without realizing bees had found it. The source could already be gone, leaving no trail except the cells in my sealed box. There was a practical limit to how long a person could watch bees return from places he could not see. I reached that limit on the 6th morning. Miles found me staring at Hive 14 through binoculars from 20 meters away. "You know they are small," he said. "The binoculars will not make them confess." "I am checking approach direction." "You have been checking approach direction for more than a week. And they keep approaching. That is one of the main things bees do." He sat beside me and handed over a fresh coffee. "Have you considered that the strange part may be over?" he asked. "Yes." "Have you considered accepting that?" "No." He nodded as though that was the answer he expected. The weather changed on the 9th morning of that routine. A warm, bright afternoon gave way to a clear night. Without clouds to hold the heat, the temperature fell steadily before dawn. There was almost no wind. By the time I arrived, the grass carried a thin layer of dew, and the low ground beyond the orchard had collected a pale band of mist. It was not cold enough to stop the bees. The air simply had the still, settled quality that made every sound travel farther. At first, Hive 14 behaved normally. A few workers appeared at the entrance just after sunrise. They cleaned the landing board, tested the air, and lifted into short circles. The neighboring colonies did the same. Then, within 10 minutes, the traffic changed. Workers began leaving 14 in a narrow stream, not in the scattered directions I had seen on previous mornings. They rose above the windbreak, turned toward the far side of the fields, and disappeared along almost the same line. Returning bees came low and fast. Their abdomens looked slightly distended, the way foragers looked when carrying a full crop of liquid. They landed heavily, paused only long enough to pass the guards, and moved inside. I checked the other colonies. They were active, but not like 14. I moved closer to the entrance and waited. The first blue stain was so small I might have missed it without the previous weeks behind me. A worker landed near the edge of the board and turned sideways. Along the pale hairs beside her mouthparts was a narrow blue mark. Not pollen. A wet stain. Another bee arrived with the same color along one front leg. Then a third. I placed a clean mesh sampling tube over part of the entrance and gently guided several returning foragers into it. The process took less than a minute. I closed the tube, moved away from the hive, and examined the bees in indirect light. None had blue pollen in their baskets. 2 carried yellow pollen. The others carried no visible pollen at all. One bee climbed the mesh, stopped, and released a tiny drop from her mouth. It gathered on the clear wall of the tube. Blue. I photographed it before transferring the bee into a second clean container for Leah. Then I released the remaining workers at the hive entrance. They disappeared inside and were replaced almost immediately by more returning bees from the same direction. The entire burst lasted 37 minutes. After that, the narrow traffic line dissolved. Foragers began arriving from several directions again. The blue-stained bees became harder to find. By mid-morning, Hive 14 looked no different from the colonies beside it. I opened the hive at noon. The replacement frame held 17 new blue cells. They formed a loose patch near the lower center, surrounded by clear nectar gathered later that morning. The separation was sharp. The bees had stored the blue liquid first, then returned to ordinary forage. For the first time, I could connect the color to a time window. Not just a day. Less than an hour. I called Leah from the field. It happened again, I said. New blue cells? And returning bees with blue liquid. I have a live sample and a droplet from one bee. Bring both. Keep the live sample cool, not cold. What does the timing tell you? That your source has office hours. 37 minutes after sunrise. Then it has very strange office hours. The droplet matched the original sample in the first comparison. Same blue color. Same acidity range. Same manufactured sugar profile. Leah needed more time for the detailed result, but the important point was already clear. The bees had not changed clear nectar inside the hive. They had arrived carrying blue liquid. The next morning was warmer and slightly windy. Hive 14 remained normal. The morning after that was cool and still again. This time, the burst began 9 minutes later than before and lasted a little more than half an hour. 14 showed the strongest traffic, but a smaller stream developed at Hive 13. By afternoon, 13 contained 5 blue cells. 2 days later, Hive 15 had 3. The source was spreading between colonies, but not in the way a disease spread. There were no sick bees, no weakening brood patterns, and no contamination across stored equipment. The pattern followed foraging behavior. One colony had discovered a rich liquid source first. Other scouts were beginning to find it independently, either by following the same scent carried on still air or by encountering the concentrated flight traffic beyond the windbreak. That raised the stakes in a very ordinary way. If more colonies learned the route, more honey would have to be removed. If nearby beekeepers' colonies found it, the source could enter honey I did not control. The color made detection easy, but I had no reason to assume every batch of the material would be blue. I called the regional food inspector and reported the laboratory findings, the quarantine, and the repeated collection. I was not required to wait until contaminated honey reached a jar before telling someone. The inspector agreed that the affected comb should remain out of the food chain and asked me to send the final lab report when it was ready. Then I called Miles. I need another set of eyes at sunrise, I said. You have had 2 sets for 12 days. I need 1 set farther down the flight line. There was a brief silence. You know the line? I know the first part. The next cool morning, we positioned ourselves nearly 1 kilometer apart. I stayed at the apiary. Miles waited beyond the fields near a low farm track that crossed the direction I had recorded. At sunrise, Hive 14 accelerated again. I watched the bees rise above the windbreak and sent Miles the bearing. For several minutes, he saw nothing. Then his voice came through the phone. I have them. How many? Enough to see a line when the light catches them. Which way after you? He described the angle. I marked it on my field sketch. The route continued beyond the orchard land, over a strip of rough grass and toward the industrial edge several kilometers away. That area contained low warehouses, workshops, a bakery, a packaging facility, and the food recovery plant I had already called. From the apiary, most of it sat below the horizon behind a shallow rise. I had searched the ground-level waste areas accessible from public roads, but I had not seen bees. Miles moved to a second point while I stayed with the hives. The visible line was intermittent. Bees disappeared against trees and buildings, then reappeared when the sun struck their wings. Still, the direction held. Nothing flowering out here, Miles said. Not enough for that traffic. What are they flying over? Closed yards. Roofs. The drainage channel. Then I lose them. Ground level? No. I looked up from my notes. What do you mean? They are climbing. How high? Hard to say. They crossed a rise low, then angle upward before the buildings. I watched another group leave Hive 14. Foragers usually adjusted height to clear trees, walls, and moving air. Climbing by itself meant little. But there were no tall trees at the industrial edge. No flowering canopy. No open hillside. Only buildings. After the morning burst ended, I drove out to meet Miles. We stood on the public side of the drainage channel, looking across a row of flat roofs. Delivery doors were closed. Waste containers were covered. Nothing on the ground suggested a source of sweet liquid. A few bees passed over us, too high to follow with the eye for more than a second. They did not descend toward the yards. They continued upward. The source was not simply somewhere near the industrial buildings. It was above them. A bee cannot tell you an address. It can, however, tell another bee where to fly. That communication happens inside the hive, on the comb, through a movement called the waggle dance. The angle of the straight run relates to direction. The duration relates roughly to distance. Wind, terrain, and the quality of the food complicate the message, but if enough bees repeat the same dance, the pattern becomes useful. I had watched dances for years without needing to turn them into a destination. Most of the time, knowing that a colony had found a strong forage source was enough. This time, somewhere beyond the rise was not enough. I fitted Hive 14 with a temporary observation section before dawn. It was not a glass display hive and I did not leave the colony exposed. It was a narrow covered box that allowed me to view one frame for short periods without disturbing the rest of the hive. I placed a camera against the panel, adjusted the focus, and waited for the first blue-stained foragers to return. They arrived 11 minutes after sunrise. Within minutes, several began dancing. The movements were not identical, but they leaned in the same direction. I recorded 23 clear runs, corrected for the sun's position, and estimated a distance that placed the source somewhere within the industrial strip we had watched the previous morning. Miles repeated the observation from a small group of colonies he managed farther south. His bees had not produced blue honey, but he placed a shallow feeder with plain syrup inside a controlled enclosure for marked test bees, then used their known return direction to check his camera setup. Once he was satisfied that the measurements were sensible, he watched for any wild foragers carrying blue stains. He found 2. Their dances pointed northwest from his site. My line and his crossed near 3 adjoining facilities, a frozen dessert workshop, a beverage packaging warehouse, and the food recovery plant. The chemistry narrowed it further. Leah called me into the laboratory 2 days later and placed a printed comparison on the bench. She had separated the sugars, acids, preservatives, and color components as far as the sample allowed. The bees collected a mixture, she said. Some ordinary nectar is present, probably from transfer inside the hive. But the blue portion resembles a processed fruit or drink concentrate more than a finished food. What tells you that? The acid ratio, the preservative, and the way the sugars have been heated. It was diluted at some point, then concentrated again. Not necessarily in that order. Could it come from a melted frozen dessert? Possible, but I would expect more fat or protein. There is almost none. Finished bottled drink? Too concentrated. Waste syrup? That would fit. I looked at the comparison sheet. Can you identify the company? No. Chemistry is not a return address. It can tell you what kind of process to look for. The food recovery plant was the only one of the 3 facilities that concentrated mixed sweet liquids. It accepted damaged containers and off-spec products from other businesses, separated packaging, and converted usable material into industrial feedstock. The receptionist who had answered my first call had been polite and certain that bees could not reach anything inside. This time I asked to speak with whoever handled environmental controls. Her name was Ruth. I expected a formal conversation. Instead, she asked me to begin with the hive. How many colonies, she said. 3 with visible blue stores. 1 heavily affected. Any honey sold? No. Everything isolated before extraction. Any dead bees? No. Do you have laboratory results? Yes. Send them. I sent the report, the photographs of the comb, and a short video of the stained foragers. Ruth called back an hour later. We processed material that could match the sugar and acid profile, she said. But there is no open product outside the building. Liquid arrives through enclosed connections. Tanks are sealed. Wash water goes into a closed recovery line. What leaves through the roof? Air. Only air? Washed air and water vapor from the concentration system. No liquid product should reach the exhaust. Should? She did not react defensively to the word. Every process has a design condition and a failure condition, she said. I am telling you the design condition. I will check the failures we monitor. That answer made me trust her more than a flat denial would have. Ruth reviewed recent spills, tank alarms, waste transfers, drain inspections, and pest control reports. Nothing matched. No blue concentrate had been released outside. No alarm had indicated carryover into the air system. The loading yard camera showed closed hoses and normal handling. Pest control staff had reported occasional wasps near empty containers, but no unusual bee activity. She invited me to walk the public access side of the site with her, provided I stayed out of operational areas. The plant looked less mysterious up close than it had from across the drainage channel. Trucks arrived, connected to enclosed unloading points, and left. Workers moved sealed containers beneath a wide canopy. The concrete around the drains was clean. Waste bins had locking lids. Air from the roof carried a faint sweet smell, but nothing strong enough to identify. I watched for bees at ground level. There were almost none. A few visited weeds along the fence. One circled a rinse station and moved on. None formed the concentrated traffic line I had seen at the hives. Ruth stood beside me near the visitor path. If this is us, she said, I need more than a possible chemistry match. We have several sweet strains inside. I cannot dismantle each one because bees flew in this direction. I understand. What would make it specific? Seeing where the bees land. She looked up at the roof. Our external cameras do not cover every vent. They are for security, not insects. Then I need to watch from outside at the right time. What is the right time? That is the part one I'm still working out. The next 2 mornings were windy. No blue cells appeared. On the 3rd, the air settled again. Miles and I positioned ourselves on a public embankment beyond the drainage channel before sunrise. From there, we could see the roofs of all 3 facilities without entering private property. I brought a long lens camera. Miles brought binoculars and, for reasons he did not explain, 2 folding chairs. We may be here a while, he said. We were not. At 14 minutes after sunrise, the first visible line crossed the rough grass behind us. The bees were difficult to see individually, but when they passed through a band of low sunlight, their wings flashed in sequence. They approached the industrial strip at the height of the warehouse roofs. Then they turned. Not toward the frozen dessert workshop. Not toward the beverage warehouse. They climbed above the food recovery plant. I followed them through the camera. For several seconds they vanished against the pale sky. Then small dark points appeared near a cluster of roof equipment on the eastern side of the plant. The traffic tightened around one rectangular housing connected to a wide metal duct. They are going into it, Miles said. I adjusted focus. Some bees landed on the outer screen. Others moved through gaps I could not resolve from that distance. More arrived. The activity was concentrated in one shaded corner beneath the duct. I recorded continuously for 26 minutes. Then the light reached the housing. The number of bees fell quickly. Within 10 minutes, the visible traffic had almost disappeared. A few workers circled the roof, then turned back toward the fields. The timing matched the hives. I called Ruth from the embankment. "We have the landing point," I said. "Where?" "Eastern roof. Rectangular housing below the largest duct in the second equipment row." There was a pause while she pictured the layout. "That is part of the condenser and air wash system," she said. "There should be nothing in it a bee could drink. There are hundreds of bees around it right now. Send me the video." By the time I returned to the apiary, the burst had ended. I captured 6 stained foragers at Hive 14 and examined them with a hand lens. The color around their mouthparts was familiar. One bee had something else caught beneath the base of a wing, a tiny pale blue bubble, dried at the edge and lighter than the honey in the cells. I transferred it to a clean slide and took it to Leah. She compared it with the original sample. "This is more diluted," she said. "And aerated. See the structure at the edge? Foam? Or condensate mixed with cleaning flow. It has the same dye and acids, but far more water. So the bees are not reaching a tank of thick syrup. Probably not. They may be reaching the place where vapor, mist, or rinse liquid collects." I sent that result to Ruth with the roof footage. She replied before the end of the day. "I have arranged access for an inspection tomorrow. Maintenance and safety staff will be present. Do not bring open hive equipment onto the roof." The source was no longer somewhere across several kilometers of landscape. It was one metal housing on one roof. But the part that should have made the mystery smaller did the opposite. The housing belonged to a closed system designed to carry washed air and water vapor. If sweet blue liquid was collecting inside it, then the system was doing something its instruments had not recorded. And it was doing it only long enough for the bees to find it before the evidence disappeared. The roof inspection began at 10 in the morning. That was already a problem. By 10, the bees had stopped visiting the housing. The metal roof was warm, the air moving steadily, and whatever had drawn the foragers there at sunrise was no longer visible. Still, Ruth could not take an outside visitor onto an industrial roof before maintenance staff had isolated the equipment and confirmed that the access route was safe. I understood the delay. I also knew we were looking at a place after it had cleaned itself. Ruth met me inside the reception area with 2 people from maintenance. One carried a tool bag. The other carried a gas monitor, a camera, and the expression of someone who had been told that bees had discovered a fault before the plant had. Ruth introduced them as Ellis and Sanaa. No one wasted time arguing about whether the video was real. They had watched it several times. We changed into protective clothing, signed the roof access sheet, and climbed a fixed stairway through the upper service level. The building grew louder as we moved upward. Pumps and fans produced a constant low vibration through the metal structure. Warm air carried the mixed smell of fruit, sugar, and clean steel. The roof itself was broad and brighter than I expected. Ducts crossed between silver housings. Pipes rose, turned, and disappeared behind insulated panels. From the ground, the equipment had looked like one complicated mass. Up close, each part had a purpose and a label. Ruth led us to the eastern equipment row. The rectangular housing from the video sat beneath a large duct from the concentration line. Air passed through a wash section, then a condenser that removed moisture before the remaining air left through the upper vent. A shallow stainless steel tray beneath the condenser collected water and returned it through a drain. At least, that was what it was supposed to collect. The outer screen covered an intake opening along one side. It was clean, new, and made from a wider mesh than the screens on the neighboring units. I pointed to it. "Was this replaced recently?" Alice looked at the maintenance tag. 3 weeks ago. "Why only this one?" "Corrosion at the lower edge." The original fine screen was restricting airflow after it warped, so the contractor fitted this grade while a replacement was ordered. "Can bees pass it?" He measured one opening with a small gauge. "Yes," he said. "Easily." That explained access, but not the liquid. Sanaa removed the outer panel after confirming the unit was isolated. Behind the screen was a narrow air space, a bank of metal fins, and the collection tray. Most of the tray was dry and clean. The shaded rear corner was neither. A thin blue film coated the steel along the seam. It was not a pool. It looked like the residue left when colored sugar water dried slowly. Dust had stuck to it. Several tiny footprints crossed the surface. Near the drain, 2 dead bees lay against the mesh. No one spoke for a moment. Ruth crouched without touching the tray. "That should be water," she said. "It was sweet enough for them to return," I said. Sanaa took sterile swabs from 3 points. I took photographs but no sample of my own. This was now an industrial contamination investigation, and chain of custody mattered more than my curiosity. Alice poured a measured amount of clean water into the far side of the tray. It flowed toward the drain and disappeared immediately. He repeated the test from the blue corner. The water hesitated along the seam, formed a shallow crescent, then moved across the tray and drained. "Not perfect," he said, "but it clears." "Under a warm roof," I said. He looked at me. "Metal moves with temperature," I continued. "A few millimeters could change the low point." Sanaa placed a level across the tray. The slope was slight but correct at that moment. Ruth turned to Ellis. "What enters this condenser during cleaning?" "Water vapor. Trace carryover if the demister is loaded." "Trace product?" "It should return to the recovery tank before the vapor stage." "Should," Ruth said. The word sounded different when she used it. We traced the line backward through the service diagrams displayed on Sanaa's tablet. The concentration system received mixed sweet liquids, removed packaging elsewhere in the plant, filtered the usable portion, and reduced water content under vacuum. At the end of each product run, an automated cleaning cycle pushed warm rinse water through the line. A diverter valve sent the first, sugar-rich rinse back into recovery. Later, cleaner rinse passed to treatment. If the valve moved late, sweet liquid could remain in the wrong part of the system. If the demister allowed fine droplets to pass, the condenser could collect more than water. If the tray held that liquid instead of draining, the coarse screen would make it available to insects. It was a useful chain of possibilities. It was not yet proof. Sanaa checked alarm history. The diverter valve had reported normal position every cycle. Differential pressure across the demister remained within limits. The drain sensor showed no blockage. Every instrument said the system was operating correctly. "Can the valve report open before it is fully open?" I asked. Alice answered. "The position switch confirms the actuator reached its endpoint." "Does it confirm when the internal seal clears the flow path?" He paused. "No. Not directly." Ruth looked at the dried blue corner again. "What did we process before each date the hives turned blue?" she asked. Sanaa opened the production schedule. The first blue cells had appeared after a run of bright blue fruit drink concentrate. The second event followed another run from the same product category. The third matched a smaller blue batch that had ended before dawn. The 12 quiet days matched clear and red products, neither of which would have left blue residue even if the same fault occurred. Color had not created the problem. Color had made the problem visible. Ruth scheduled a controlled observation for the next blue run, 2 nights later. The plant would operate normally, but the roof unit would be monitored before, during, and after the cleaning cycle. Additional samples would be taken from the recovery line, the condenser, and the drain tray. If the system began releasing product where it should not, the line could be stopped. I asked to observe from the roof access platform. Ruth agreed on the condition that I remain with Sanaa and follow instructions immediately if the line was shut down. We arrived at 4:30 in the morning. The roof felt entirely different before dawn. The metal housings had cooled. Condensation silvered the outer surfaces. Steam from distant vents flattened in the still air instead of rising quickly. The lights along the service path made the equipment appear more separate, each unit standing inside its own pale circle. Below us, the blue concentrate run was ending. At 5:10, the product line switched to cleaning. For several minutes, nothing unusual happened. Clear condensate moved through the return sight glass. The collection tray remained dry. The diverter valve changed state on the control display. Then Ellis, watching a transparent section of the line below, spoke over the radio. Actuator says open. Flow is still restricted. The internal seal had not cleared with the actuator. Cold, sticky residue around the valve shaft delayed the actual movement even though the external position switch had reached its endpoint. For just under 4 minutes, the first sugar-rich rinse met a partially blocked route. Pressure did not rise enough to trigger an alarm. Instead, the vacuum draw pulled a fine mist past the demister and toward the rooftop condenser. The change inside the housing was quiet. A faint blue tint appeared on the metal fins. Droplets gathered, ran downward, and reached the tray. At the same time, Sanaa's level sensor showed the effect of the cold roof. The support beneath the rear edge had contracted slightly more than the opposite side. The tray's lowest point shifted away from the drain. Blue liquid collected in the shaded corner. Not much. Perhaps 2 shallow cups spread across the steel. Enough for bees. The drain itself was not blocked. It was simply no longer at the lowest point while the housing was cold. A bracket replaced during the same maintenance visit had been fitted a few millimeters higher than the original. In daytime warmth, the metal expanded and the slope corrected itself. Before sunrise, the liquid waited. We watched the pool form behind the coarse mesh. At 5:40, the valve seal finally moved fully. The blue mist faded. Clearer water followed and diluted the pool but did not remove it. The sky began to lighten. The first bee arrived at 6:02. She landed on the screen, moved along the openings, and passed inside. 3 more came within a minute. Then 12. Then enough that counting became pointless. They gathered along the edge of the blue liquid and drank. Some slipped on the wet steel and climbed out with color on their legs and bodies. Others filled quickly, moved back through the mesh, and lifted into the air. From the roof, I could see their departure line angle toward the orchard. There was no mystery left in that movement. They were flying home. The sun reached the housing 27 minutes later. As the metal warmed, the tray shifted. The shallow pool moved toward the drain and disappeared. The remaining film began to dry. Bee traffic thinned almost at once. By 10 in the morning, the unit would again look almost clean. The process had not been hidden by a person. It had been hidden by timing. A valve that reported the movement of its actuator rather than the movement of its internal seal. A demister that allowed a small amount of mist through without crossing an alarm threshold. A replacement bracket that changed the tray's cold weather slope. A temporary screen wide enough for bees. Each choice was ordinary on its own. Together, they created a blue pool on a roof for less than an hour. Ruth stopped the line as soon as the observation was complete. No one argued about the source now. The swab from the dried film, the fresh condensate, and the honey all matched in color, acid profile, and preservative. The route from product to hive had been observed from beginning to end. Still, one question remained before we could say the case was fully understood. The mechanism explained how blue liquid reached the roof. It did not yet explain why I-14 had found it first, why the other colonies had followed later, or why weather decided whether the bees came at all. We had found the source. Now we had to explain the pattern. Finding the pool did not finish the investigation. It gave us a mechanism. A mechanism becomes an explanation only when it accounts for every part of the pattern, including the parts that first looked unimportant. Ruth set up a meeting the same afternoon in a small room above the processing floor. On the table were the plant's production times, maintenance dates, weather observations from my notebook, hive weight records, Leah's laboratory results, and the photographs of every blue frame. No one had to force the pieces together. The dates did it for us. The first blue honey appeared the morning after the temporary course screen had been fitted and the tray support replaced. That night, the plant had processed blue fruit concentrate and ended the run with a pre-dawn cleaning cycle. The second appearance followed the same type of product. So did the third. The 12 days without blue honey included no blue product runs at all. The plant had processed clear sweet liquids, pale fruit concentrate, and one red batch. If the carryover fault occurred during those runs, the bees would have collected colorless or differently colored liquid. Yet my hive showed no red honey. At first that seemed like a gap. Then Leah compared the plant samples. The red product used a different stabilizer and produced less aromatic rinds. It also ran on 2 warm, windy mornings when the roof tray drained normally and any scent from the housing dispersed away from the orchard. The clear products could have created a brief pool, but without color I would not have recognized a few cells mixed into ordinary nectar. Samples from the quarantine clear honey contained a faint rise in the same preservative during one of those dates, small enough to be overlooked without knowing what to test for. The contamination had not begun when the honey turned blue. The blue had shown us the contamination was happening. Weather explained the timing at the hives. On the 3 strong collection mornings, the night had been clear enough to cool the roof housing, the dawn had been calm, and the light wind had moved from the plant toward the orchard. Cool metal shifted the tray's low point away from the drain. Still air allowed the sweet odor to settle along the same corridor the bees later flew. As sunlight warmed the unit, the tray corrected and the source disappeared. On warm nights, the tray kept its daytime slope and drained. On windy mornings, the odor plume broke apart before scouts could follow it. The plant could run the same process without creating the same result. That was why the source had seemed to have a schedule more precise than the production line alone. It depended on a product, a cleaning cycle, a cold housing, a delayed valve, a shifted tray, an open mesh, and suitable air. Remove any one of them and the blue cells did not appear. Hive 14's role was simpler. The colony had entered late summer stronger than its neighbors. It had more foragers and fewer remaining floral resources near the hive. One scout encountered the odor line from the roof, followed it to the temporary pool, and returned with a reward richer than anything available in the fields. Her dance recruited others from the same colony. A successful source changes a hive quickly. Returning foragers repeat the direction. Recruits follow. More successful returns strengthen the signal. Within one morning, dozens of bees can become hundreds without any colony outside the hive knowing why. That explained the concentrated traffic from 14. The later spread to hives 13 and 15 did not require bees to exchange instructions across colonies. Their scouts flew through the same air, encountered the same odor, and saw the repeated traffic line forming above the windbreak. The source had become easier to find because one colony was already using it heavily. The stains explained themselves too. No blue pollen appeared because the source was liquid, not a flower. The color around the bees' mouthparts came from drinking. The paler residue beneath the wing was aerated condensate from the tray. The nearly pollen-free blue sample reflected processed sugar. The acids and preservative matched the plant's concentrate. The sealed comb proved the bees had carried the liquid into the hive before storing and capping it. Even the clean ground around the facility fit. The leak never reached the yard. It existed inside a rooftop housing and drained away after the sun warmed the metal. A person could inspect the plant at midday, see dry concrete and sealed containers, and honestly believe there was no accessible sugar anywhere on site. Nothing had lied to us. We had simply been looking at different hours of the same system. Ruth closed the concentration line until the physical changes were complete. The diverter valve was removed, cleaned, and replaced with a design that confirmed internal flow position rather than actuator travel alone. The demister pad was replaced. The tray support was reset to create a reliable slope at both cold and warm temperatures. A fine food-safe insect screen replaced the temporary mesh. An overflow sensor was installed in the shaded corner, along with a small camera aimed inside the housing. The plant also changed the cleaning sequence. The first sweet rinse would now remain inside recovery until a second independent sensor confirmed the route was fully open. Ruth notified the food and environmental authorities, nearby beekeepers, and the businesses whose off-spec material had been processed during the affected period. She did not wait for someone else to turn the problem into a larger one. The embarrassing version, she told me, is the version where bees found it before our instruments did. What is the useful version? I asked. The useful version is that they found it before the honey was sold. I could agree with that. At the apiary, I removed every frame that contained visible blue stores. I also removed adjacent uncapped nectar from the affected colonies and sent representative samples to Leah. The comb did not go into animal feed, wax recovery, or any product that might return to food. It was documented and disposed of through the same controlled waste route used for other contaminated food material. That part felt wasteful. Good comb represented weeks of work by thousands of bees. But the loss was mine to absorb. Unknown industrial liquid did not become acceptable because the bees had spent effort on it. The unaffected supers remained isolated until the tests came back. Leah found no significant trace in the outer stores of most colonies. Hive 14 required the most removal. Even there, the contamination had been caught early enough that the colony retained ample safe food. No blue honey had reached a jar. No customer had eaten it. No colony had been harmed. The plant restarted the line 6 days later under controlled observation. Ruth deliberately scheduled a blue concentrate run followed by the same early cleaning window. The weather helped us, another clear night, a cool roof, and light air moving toward the orchard. It was as close to the original conditions as we were likely to get. Sanam monitored the valve and condenser. The internal route opened fully before the sweet rinse moved. The demister remained clean. Condensate reached the tray and flowed directly to the drain. The overflow sensor stayed dry. At sunrise, I waited at Hive 14. The bees began ordinary orientation flights. A few foragers headed toward the orchard margin. Others crossed the fields in several directions. No narrow stream formed toward the plant. Miles watched from the embankment. Ruth watched the roof camera. Leah waited for samples we hoped not to send. For 1 hour, nothing happened. That nothing was different from the 12 quiet days before. This time we understood it. I opened Hive 14 at noon. The bees had placed fresh clear nectar in the replacement comb. Some cells were almost transparent. Others carried the faint gold of late clover. Not one was blue. Ruth kept the line under enhanced monitoring through 2 more cleaning cycles. The result held. The source was closed. The route was broken. The hives returned to the flowers available around them. By then, every important question had an answer except one I had not expected to matter. What should the blue honey mean after it was gone? For the plant, it was a process failure. For the laboratory, it was a contamination profile. For me, it was a frame I had removed from a healthy hive on an ordinary morning. We had solved how it happened. I was still deciding what, if anything, I had learned from seeing it. 6 weeks after the roof unit was repaired, Leah called and told me I could stop sending her honey. I mean that kindly, she added. I understood. The latest samples are clean. No blue color, no preservative pattern, no unusual acid ratio. The clear honey from 14 now matches the forage profile from the other colonies. What about the traces in the earlier clear sample? Gone. The source is gone. That was the last laboratory answer I needed. By then, the apiary had settled into early autumn. The orchard leaves had begun to dull at the edges. Mornings arrived later, and the bees waited longer before lifting from the entrances. On warm afternoons they still worked the clover and the last flowering herbs along the drainage banks, but the season had turned toward storage and preparation. Hive 14 was healthy. The queen continued laying in a compact pattern. The population had started its normal seasonal decline. The replacement frames were partly filled with ordinary honey, pale gold near the top and nearly clear in the freshest cells. I had watched those frames more closely than any comb deserved. For the first 2 weeks, every glint of cool light made me lean closer. Blue can hide inside reflections when you have trained yourself to expect it. But each time I turned the frame toward the sun, the color resolved into wax, shadow, and normal honey. Miles eventually stopped asking whether I had found another blue cell. Instead, he began arriving with breakfast on inspection mornings, which was his way of suggesting I should return to being a person who noticed food before noon. One morning, we stood beside 14 while the bees moved through a patch of sunlight at the entrance. If the syrup had been clear, he said, would you have seen it? Not immediately. Would the lab have found it? Only if I had sent a sample for some other reason. He watched a worker arrive with cream-colored pollen packed against both hind legs. So the blue was useful. The blue was contamination. I did not say it was good. I said it was useful. He was right. The color had not caused a process failure. It had exposed it. Without that color, the bees might have collected a small amount of industrial sweet liquid, mixed it into floral nectar, and left no visible reason for me to test it. The batches would probably still have been limited by weather and timing, but limited did not mean acceptable. The thing that looked most unnatural had made the natural behavior of the bees easier to understand. They had not been confused. They had found sugar. From their point of view, the rooftop pool was an excellent food source, concentrated, easy to drink, unguarded, and available when flowers nearby offered less. They had no category for industrial concentrate. They did not distinguish a flower from a manufacturing fault. They measured reward in sweetness, distance, and effort. The human systems around them had made all the distinctions and still missed the opening. Ruth sent me the final root cause summary after the plant completed its review. It was only a few pages, written plainly. A temporary course screen allowed insect access. A replacement support altered the drain tray's cold temperature slope. A sticky internal valve seal delayed the first rinse even after the actuator reported a completed movement. Fine sweet droplets passed into the condenser without triggering an alarm. Blue product runs made the carryover visible. Cool, calm mornings allowed a temporary pool and carried its scent toward the apiary. A scout from Hive 14 found it and recruited nestmates. Neighboring colonies found it later. Sunlight warmed the housing, corrected the slope, and drained the pool before daytime inspections. Nothing in the summary required a hidden person, a dishonest worker, or an impossible event. No one had poured syrup onto the roof. No one had altered my hives. No one had chosen 14. Several reasonable systems had failed in ways that overlapped for less than an hour. That was enough. The plant kept the new screen, valve monitoring, tray sensor, and roof camera in place. Ruth also added a simple inspection step after any maintenance that changed airflow or drainage. Nearby beekeepers received a notice describing what to look for in comb and how to report unusual stores. The food inspector closed the case after confirming that no affected honey had entered sale. The financial part was less interesting but still real. I lost the value of the removed comb, the honey it contained, and the time spent sampling and monitoring. The plant covered the laboratory and disposal costs without an argument. We agreed on the rest through ordinary paperwork. No one became rich. No one was ruined. The useful outcome was smaller and better than that. The access point was closed, the honey remained out of food, and the process would now detect the same fault even if the next liquid was colorless. I visited the plant roof once more after the review ended. Ruth met me at the access stair, and Sanat joined us with the new inspection checklist. The eastern housing looked almost unchanged from outside. The replacement mesh was finer, the drain support sat lower, and a small sensor cable ran toward the shaded corner of the tray. Inside, the steel was dry. No blue film. No beet tracks. No dead insects against the screen. The roof camera had recorded several cool dawns. Bees sometimes crossed the frame on their way elsewhere, but none landed on the housing. Ruth rested one hand on the outer panel. I used to think a closed system was something you could confirm by looking at the doors, she said. What do you think now? That closed is a condition you have to keep proving. That stayed with me. Beekeeping works the same way. A healthy colony is not a permanent fact. It is a condition you confirm through brood, food, behavior, weather, and time. The moment you stop looking because the last inspection was good, the hive continues changing without you. A week after the final clean result, I harvested a small amount of honey from Hive 14. I used separate equipment out of habit, even though the test said separation was no longer necessary. The cappings came away cleanly. Honey moved through the filter in a slow amber sheet and collected in a clear container beneath it. No blue line appeared at the edges. No sharp fruit syrup smell rose from the surface. I sent one last jar to Leah before keeping any for myself. When she cleared it, I opened another jar at the work table where the first blue vial had stood weeks earlier. This time I tasted it. The honey was mild, floral, and slightly warm from the room. I could recognize clover in it, and something darker from the hedgerows. It tasted exactly like honey from that site should taste at the end of summer. That ordinary taste gave me more satisfaction than I expected. I kept no blue comb as a souvenir. The affected material had been contaminated food, and treating it like a trophy would have confused the lesson. Leah retained a sealed analytical sample under laboratory controls because reference material could help if another beekeeper reported the same problem. I kept the photographs, the field notes, and the dates. Those were enough. The following spring, I returned the colonies to the same orchard. The hive stood in 2 even rows beside the windbreak. New blossom opened across the trees. The air filled with the thick, steady sound that only strong colonies make when major nectar flow begins. Hive 14 was still there. I opened it on a clear morning and lifted a frame of fresh white comb. Nectar shone in hundreds of cells. In the lower half, workers packed pale pollen beside the brood. The queen moved calmly across the center, attended by a small circle of bees. Everything fit the season, the colony, and the place. Before closing the hive, I watched one worker arrive at the entrance. She paused on the landing board with a full pollen load, cleaned one antenna, and went inside. I did not follow her flight backward in my head. I did not wonder whether the light had hidden another color. I had learned the difference between attention and suspicion. The mystery had begun because I saw something that should not have been inside a sealed cell. It ended when every part of that color had a path, from a blue concentrate, through a delayed rinse, into a cold condenser, across a tilted tray, behind an open screen, into a bee's crop, and finally into the comb in my hands. There was no missing piece after that. Just bees following sugar. Just people correcting a system. And, once again, honey the color it was supposed to be.